Okay, I just want to check, am I audible?
Yep, you're audible and visible.
Ladies and gentlemen on the floor, we personally believe that ends justify the means. Now, this debate is arguing whether regulatory authorities should prioritize outcomes-based environmental regulations or process-based ones. Now, we, the government, firmly believe that outcomes-based environmental regulations are better from multiple angles, not only for the environment as a whole, but also for the companies themselves. Now, why? Because how does this look like on our side? With regulatory authorities prioritizing outcomes-based environmental regulations, what they'll be doing is examining the results of these companies, how much the end product of what they do can actually better the environment, or at least measure the extent to which these people can help the environment. Whereas with process-based environmental regulations, they will be more focusing on how these how outcomes are achieved, whether good or bad. So they will just care whether a process is followed or a technology is applied. However, the results of these technologies will not actually be closely examined because they are not being regulated. So why does it look better on our side for outcomes-based environmental regulations to be imposed? The main point we like to put forward is accessibility, because not all companies are the same. Now, we do understand that these regulations are obviously based on industry to industry, but even within industries themselves, companies are diverse, whether in scale or in scope. So take at a baseline level for process-based regulations, let's say a technology of a moderate level is supposed to be imposed by all companies. How would this look like for companies who are of a lower, of a smaller scale? Could they afford to have the budget constraints of having to apply these technologies, and how much would it affect the actual outcome? Because we do agree the main stakeholder of this debate is the environment. However, companies themselves do have a big stake in this debate, and it actually depends a lot on whether they can produce their actual the actual goal, that is to get profits and to actually increase productivity. So, for example, a smaller scale company who has to employ these higher scale technologies or processes would actually, not only will it get financial constraints, but also manpower constraints, which could actually affect the company's results in the long run. It could affect their productivity, and because they are not equipped to actually utilize these technologies and processes, it might even hamper the environmental outcomes that they actually put out, and it could not be good for the environment, or it could be such a minuscule change that it doesn't actually change anything. Now, take for example the other end of that scale, in which a large company, a very high scale and high well-to-do company, has to employ these moderate level technologies. Now, if we impose this technology on them, they will have to actually lower their standards, because maybe these companies could have employed much better means to help the environment, but because they are regulated to have this certain technology or process, it actually hampers what they could potentially be achieving.
Mior,
Accepted.
can you give us one example of the better regulatory methods you talked about?
Better, yeah, we have proven, we are saying that it's better for outcomes, because it doesn't matter if they are doing what they're told to do, but if they're not doing it right, how does that help the environment? Because the environment doesn't see the process, the environment feels the results. So we can impose all we want, we can say do ABC, but if someone thinks ABC equals D and instead of E, then it doesn't really help the environment, because the results are the only things that impact the environment. The environment doesn't really care if a person uses the processes that are deemed common consensus, but the environment cares about the actual effects these processes have, and therefore processes have to suit suitability and accessibility of the companies. Therefore, not only on our side do we take into account exactly whether or not these companies can actually achieve a substantial change, and actually whether or not they can employ these processes in the first place. Because on the environmental side, if these processes do not actually get the best results, the environment will be harmed. And on the company side, if these regulations are too strict, or at least put too much burden on them financially or in terms of achieving their productivity, that actually is bad for the company. So not only are we stressing the fact that the environmental factor is not guaranteed with these process-based regulations, we also showing how it's actually against companies' incentives to actually adhere to these process-based regulations, because it could be bad for them in terms of achieving their profit. And we do know that companies' main goal is for profits, whether or not it could be good or bad. That is the incentive, and so we have to work with the status quo in which companies will always put incentives ahead of everything else. Moving on, we also feel that the process-based environmental regulations would actually put more strain on the regulators themselves, because when you introduce regulations on processes, they will have to be maintained and checked all the time. So it will put much more resources into having to just check these things all the time, whereas outcomes-based will be much more easier and much more tangible thing to evaluate, because all you have to do is see the end result and the direct consequences these companies have put on the environment. Whereas with process-based regulations, sure, you can check how technologies are implemented and all that, but in terms of actual structures of how they would go about their businesses, that is something that takes more time, more energy, and is more subjectivity to being scrutinized. Therefore, it's, even if it has the same amount of positives as the outcomes-based regulations, it's not as easy to hold to an objective level, because results are results. Results cannot lie, and they are what I stated. However, processes can be taken subjectively. What if a company uses a process, the correct process, but in a wrong way, or in a way that does not produce actual results? They just go through the motions, and therefore they become stagnant. Now, what the government proposes is that outcomes-based results are good in the long run, because they incentivize these companies to be proactive in helping the environment. By allowing them to achieve a set outcome with their own means, companies will find ways, and industries will find ways to achieve these outcomes in the way that most suits their company, and that can maximize results of both for the environment and for profit. Whereas with process-based results, we are boxing them into a set structure in which they need to follow, and so it does not allow them any room to grow. They will just think, okay, we have to do this, so we'll do this. Whether or not that's actually good, it doesn't matter to us, because we won't be judged on it and it won't affect us. Because it's naive to assume that most companies care that much about the environment, in which they will make sure that these processes actually meet the results that are needed. They will just do what they have to do to ensure that they can get away with as much money as possible. And we have put forward why outcomes-based environmental regulations would prove that they will be held to higher scrutiny, because outcomes will always be more tangible than processes. Now, we also believe that when we emphasize outcomes over processes, it will allow companies to innovate environmental processes, because when we give them a blank slate in which they can work on, they will always find innovations to ensure an environmental net gain is maximized, because it will look better for them, and companies that actually produce better results would get more fundings or more business, or just be looked at and have better public opinion in general. So companies would actually be incentivized with this blank slate to work harder to get better environmental processes, maybe those even better than government funded ones, because privatization and all that will lead to more innovations and better ways in which we can improve these outcomes. Whereas on the process base, how would that look like in their world? It will look like that set things by the government would just be followed by the companies, and they won't actually finish. And with that, I would like to end my speech. Thank you.
All right, I'd like to thank the Prime Minister for that fine speech. Please note that anything after 7:15 will be noted down. Calling for leader of opposition to open the case on side.
Sorry, can I just interject? So do we have to keep our own time, because we were used to getting like a 7-minute warning in our previous debate?
Yeah, so you're ideally supposed to be keeping your own timer, but I think for the sake of this, John, I can keep a timer, and I'll drop timestamps just for the convenience sake, if that's all right. Cool, opening up when you're ready.
All right, I'm audible.
Yep, audible and visible.
All right, cool. Just setting up my timer. All right. Speech starting in 3, 2, 1. When you compromise the speculative ends that dictate the means, we see an opening opposition that you open up a can of worms and a ton of leeways for corporations and companies who are profit-driven to skirt and to trim the very fundamentals of regulations. Because we support pragmatic processes that consolidate the virtual of regulations we're immensely proud to oppose. One argument in the speech in terms of why outcome-based regulations are ineffective and why in the comparative the processes are the best. But before that, just 2 points of framing and a couple of framing on our stance. Firstly, first point of framing then is what are these regulatory bodies we're talking about? We think oftentimes we're talking about the state. This looks like the environmental ministries, the EPA, which is the Environmental Protection Agency in the United States that regulates pollution and enforces green regulations. Second of all, we suggest the end goal in this debate were all corners of the houses, which is the same, which is to protect and to shield the environment from the unscrupulous pollution. The question in this debate therefore needs to be which attempt and which way is the best to engage with this. Third point of framing then, what do we support on the side of opening opposition? We support process-based regulations and have a bunch of examples for this. Things like when we force factories to install sulfur scrubbers for the inner chimneys, to force them to have waste treatment plants before they actually dispose their toxic waste. But it also looks like forcing car manufacturers to install catalytic converters in car exhaust pipes. And lastly, this also looks like enforcing limitations on air pollution, chemicals use, and etc. Things like your CFCs and your CO2 emissions, and etc. The concern that the opening government right here is that it's largely inaccessible because these things are expensive. I have a couple of responses to this. The first is, I'll suggest things like sulfur scrubbers and things like, I don't know, your cannabis are not at times not as expensive, but in fact are inexpensive in its case. But second, we suggest we're talking about multi-million-dollar companies who are profiting off tons of millions and billions annually. This looks like your Apple, this looks like your tech giant, your Samsung, and etc. But it also looks like your Amazon. If they want to claim the accessibility argument in its space, they have to show why the vast majority of instances that is apparatuses are prohibitively exorbitant to the extent where these companies like Amazon cannot afford it, but if not, it's literally futile and uncomparative. Before the companies that they're concerned about, which are relatively small and still, we suggest two things. First, we have state subsidies that actually into place, because if it's inaccessible at large, we suggest counterintuitive the principle of the state. But second, we suggest small companies oftentimes pollute less, they are less part of the space, but even if they have to like impose purchase conversion, etc., they purchase it on a small scale, which is relatively less prohibitively exorbitant. What do they have to support, therefore, in their city house? We suggest they have to support outcome-based regulations, ostensibly. This looks like regulators don't care about how outcomes are achieved. They just want these processes to be done, which the process does not need to be reviewed. But it also looks like reducing carbon output by a set percentage to reduce water pollution by X year, and the energy consumption and other ways, etc. Having that framed, before I move on to the first argument, I'll take a POI from closing. All right, seeing that, let's move on. Why do we prefer process over outcome regulatory measures in this case? I have three characterizations exactly what outcome bases are unpreferable. The first is that I suggest oftentimes outcome-based regulatory methods are immensely malleable. This looks like outcome-based metrics. They're oftentimes determined and dictated by regulatory bodies and literally are not the best decision makers. When outcomes are vague, they're subjected to lobbying and being skirted by corporations. This looks like the lobbying power the immense amount of lobbying power to which corporations actually capture in a lot of places. Things like they have the power to influence the legislation and the decisions of the political or of our politicians. So, for example, the tobacco companies were suppressing regulations on smoking for years and years, who have undertaken and have harmed children's health to such a significant extent because it was easy to sell cigarettes to them. But second of all, it's because of their direct profit incentive to do this, which is especially when alternatives are more expensive on their side of the house. The second characterization to this, which I'll flag, is that outcomes are oftentimes unspecific, because it allows companies to engage in creative measures and creative means to displace their pollution. For example, corporations will displace pollution elsewhere. Things like if you want to reduce air pollution, instead switch it to land-based pollutants, but you still claim reduction in air pollution. So the fact is you can oftentimes shift the amount of pollution from a particular sector to the other, but symmetrically you're still polluting in both these circumstances. We think oftentimes you allow corporations to scapegoat and to exploit this particular measure on their side of the house. But but literally also things like tax breaks that can actually come with it. The last piece of characterization right here is that outcomes are oftentimes unforeseen and risky, because this looks like you're a pharmaceutical company still pushing drugs out even if the risk of side effects. Things like companies continuing to pollute and poisoning the community's water supply, etc., because they want to maximize their profit-driven incentives. All of these things mean that the damages that are likely to be imposed on the side of government's comparative is unforeseen. Research is suppressed, and companies oftentimes being ignored. The dodge liability and legally in a court of political opinion. That is exactly why intrinsically all of these reasons were given you. If the government wishes to win this debate, they have to disprove all of these reasons, or else it is clear that outcome-based regulatory models are bad. Before I move on to explain why the comparative on our side on processes are a lot more specific and why it's comparatively better, I'll take a POI from closing. It's not opening?
POI?
Yeah, sure. Anyone.
So understandably, while you say that this lobbying happens, don't you think your model is too utopian to even be practically be implemented? While you say these governments have lobbying, they also have lobbying for process-based regulation. Why is lobbying different for outcome-based regulations and they're different for process-based regulations?
All right, like that exceeded 15 seconds. But whatever was said is that the model is more, and it's at least why the model is utopian, because literally we've proven why it's not inaccessible as what OG claimed. But second of all, we're given substantive reasons why the states have the ability to regulate to these things, specifically on our side of health. You need to disprove and engage with those things instead of just POIing out of nowhere. So why is the comparative from the opening opposition therefore superior in this case? It is on two ways. First, we suggest it's significantly more certain, and it's hard for corporations to manipulate. Things like regulators can spot check whether corporate compliances are there. Things like whether your regulators or whether your I don't know, like your catalysts, or whether or not your scrubbers are actually present, and immediately find companies for non-compliance. We say companies cannot obfuscate responsibility by taking down the road. It's already 6. Look at the timer. But second of all, it's easier for green movements to call up bad corporations symmetrically as well. But second of all, we suggest on a comparative, the impact is superior. Because processes are usually well researched and proven efficacy. This answers opening governments are concerned about like the inefficacy of this, because we suggest if it is inefficient to begin with, it is speculated that the corporations or the state will likely to enforce these things to begin with. That is why, most likely or not, it is scientifically proven methods are likely to be effective to be imposed on a comparative of the opening of opposition. But it's only on the emphasis, when you emphasize the process of it, that these measures are likely, these scientific measures were scientifically proven to be effective, are likely to be taken into account, are likely to be imposed. For these reasons, we oppose.
I'd like to thank the leader for that fine speech, calling upon DPM to extend the case on site. Here.
Yeah, all right. So POIs verbally, I'll begin my speech now. So panel, environmental damages cannot be mitigated by just regulations alone, right? It has to become something that everyone is conscious of, all right? That everyone is aware of and actively works towards solving this problem. It cannot be something that you're doing just because there's a rule, but it has to become something that that you are doing because you are consciously aware of it, because you want to solve it, right? All right, so my rebuttals to the points made by the opposition here will be integrated into points of my own, right? So beginning with the first one, right? The net positive gain of both methods here are the same, right? So what we have to prove to you is why outcomes-based regulations are better than process-based regulations. Because at the end of it, like my first speaker has said, at the end of it, the environment feels the effects. It doesn't feel the processes. It doesn't matter what route you take, right? You can take route A, route B. At the end of the day, you still finish the race. You finish the marathon, all right? What's important is that the outcome is the same, which is in this case, in the case of our debate here, is to reduce environmental damages through these regulations, right? So the first benefit, right, that outcomes-based regulations gives is that it's not basing our progress, right, our successes off of some projection of the results, right? For example, like in a process-based regulation, you have things like how far away an exit is from a certain place, or how much smoke is being, how much a certain type of gas is being released on a certain day. So these are just projections. They are just aspects of like the greater goal, which is to reduce environmental damage. So a lot of times these things, they don't necessarily reflect what is truly the best for the environment, right? Because it's just like a particular aspect of it. There can be a lot of other things that these regulations don't take into consideration, but because it's a rule, it's being followed, right? So and when it doesn't take things that are into consideration, overall, you may not be achieving like your goal. You're only like dealing with like a short-term problem instead of actually dealing with like the bigger picture of things. All right. So by having outcomes-based regulations, the results are more tangible. Now, it may seem counterintuitive at first, but it's actually more objective because you have one final goal, right? While the process to get there may be subjective, may differ, of course, with each company, as my first speaker has said already. It is overall more objective, and the goal is one thing. It cannot be like diluted and like taken out of context and done differently. Okay, of course, this also ties in with how different companies have like different cultures, different technological availabilities, different resources. So it is better for them to have one final goal and use whatever means they have available to them to achieve this. Okay, before I move on to my, yes, I'll take the POI.
POI, why would you trust these companies who have been polluting like the earth for years? Why would you trust them to actually fulfill that requirement?
All right, I've got elaborations on this later, but I will answer the question right now. Why do you trust companies to follow regulations when they are set and specific? There are always like rules and like technicalities that they can run circles around, they can just flout, they can like win things on technicalities. What guarantee is there that they would follow this? Now, opposition here would be operating under the assumption that these regulating authorities would like always be watching these companies and making sure that they don't make these mistakes, right? That they follow the rules to the law. Well, in the same way, these regulating authorities are also making sure that in outcomes-based, in a world where outcomes-based regulations is practiced, they are making sure that the final outcome is reached, right? It doesn't matter if what process they use to take it, but eventually at the end, the net positive gain is achieved, and that is what we want. We all want to save the environment over here. It's just that outcomes-based does a better job of doing it than process-based does, all right? So on to that, right? So the opposition puts forward a point about, so yeah, talking about that, there are times when really the opposition might bring up a point where because they are not being as scrutinized, not easy to monitor, like scrutinize them because of the subjectivity of the methods, right? So what's stopping them from doing something that is harmful to the environment in that short term? Well, our even if that was true, right, we will concede that is a possibility, but our argument here is that sometimes the ends justify the means. And in the case of like environmental damages and stuff like this, we think it's okay for a company to not be as strict in their regulations for a certain period of time, as long as they achieve the final aim, which is to reduce environmental damages, right, through these process-based regulations. So it's all right if maybe they are releasing a bit more smoke or something like that than a company that is practicing a regulations-based, a process-based regulation. But as long as within the same amount of time, they achieve the same aim, they completely like cut off like their pollution and all that, then we think it's okay, because at the end of the day, we still want to achieve the same thing. The net positive is still achieved. Now this moves me to my other point here, right? By having outcomes-based regulations, what you're doing is you're incentivizing companies to take an active role in preventing environmental harms, right? So let me paint a bit what this looks like. So in a process-based regulation, what you have like an external authority figure who is coming to your company, who is briefing you on these rules, who is setting these regulations, and is expecting you to like follow them, right? So a lot of times these people, they don't have like a completely accurate picture of what the company looks like, what the company culture is, what resources are available to them. So they might not be able to set regulations that are the most effective in like tackling the problems, right? So in comparison, an outcomes-based regulation, while of course there is a third-party monitoring whether these outcomes are achieved, there's more freedom to the employees itself, to the employers and to the employees to use what they have available to achieve this net positive gain, right? So by having this, what you're doing is you are encouraging employers themselves to have to think about how they want to achieve this outcome. Instead of being dictated, they are now taking an active role. They are using their own intelligence to come up with some methods that might do this, right? And because they have a better understanding of how everything works, they can take unique steps that based on the resources and things that they have available. So in a process-based regulation where the rules are always shifting, where specific things have to be met, this causes a lot of frustration, change in procedure, and these things can really upset the workers, right? Which can affect like productivity and efficiency of the companies. While in a process-based regulation system, so when the employers take more active role, so it's a lot more It's a lot more free, right? So they can do things that are more suitable while also achieving the same goal. The difference is this does not hamper workplace productivity and efficiency as much as process-based does, right? Also, what this does is this equip the companies to make their own significant change, because it ingrains within their culture itself that this is something that the companies have thought up and they are doing it without having to be told what to do. So they independently become like agents of change to stop environmental damage. I'm out of time, so that's all from me. Thank you.
All right, I'd like to thank the DPM for that fine speech. Calling upon the DLO, here.
All right, checking that audio is clear.
Yep, audible and visible.
All right, great. POIs in the chat prefer to engage the closing gulf. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Opening opposition believes that letting the ends justify the means is often a carte blanche for corporations to do everything they can to follow the letter of the law at the direct expense of actual environmental change and actual positive trends with regards to reducing environmental pollution. So long the outcomes are determined by fallible state agencies subject to corporate capture, we proven conclusively in the leader of opposition to zero response in the previous speaker, we think the benefits may be accrued even if you meet those arbitrary set outcomes and goal, but the cost will always be infinitely greater because of the profit incentive, meaning corporations are also going to exploit and find ways to maneuver around these regulations in order to gain like a leg up and like just continue to profit even at the expense of the environment. At the top here, before I go into further responses, I just want to flag at this point of the debate that it's extremely unclear in the opening government what is it exactly that they want to support, because for all the times they said the word outcome-based regulation, they've yet to provide an example of what an outcome-based regulation look like. So are they going to reduce like energy consumption? Are they going to reduce like carbon output? Like what exactly is this going to look like? How are they going to enforce it? And all of these things means that at the absolute best case, even if they're able to demonstrate the outcome-based regulations are preferable, it is unclear what this benefit looks like, which means when you weigh it against the well-mechanized and complex and sophisticated analysis in weighted speech, you ought to value that to a greater extent. The primary weighing in this debate is in terms of which side is more effective at tackling environmental solution. Is it better through a process-based approach, better through an outcome-based approach? And I think that the determining factor about who wins this comparative is going to come down to in which side are corporations best able to maneuver and skirt this green regulation. Because we identify that this profit-seeking corporation obviously will want to maximize their profit. And in many instances, green regulations and environmentally friendly regulations come to the direct cost of profit because it like costs money to implement these kinds of measures, etc. Meaning to say, if we're able to show that an outcome-based regulation is subject to corporate capture, manipulation, and maneuvering, we're then able to show that it is unlikely these things is going to lead towards actual benefit, which means that the certain benefits of process-based regulations ought to be prioritized because it's a lot more beneficial. And I'm going to prove that it actually works, unlike what CG believes. I think CG also identifies in the POI that the profit-seeking corporations will probably lobby against green regulation in either world because they undercut profit. The question is, where is it harder for them to get away with those things? And I think it's significantly harder to get away when you lobby for process-based regulation for two reasons. The first thing, it is easier for you to directly check if corporations are complying with this regulation and then find them if they are not. So when the EU imposed like regulations that force factories in the EU to install sulfur scrubbers, it was just easy for you to regulator to show up at a factory, say, hi, I'm here to check whether you have actually complied with those regulations. If they didn't install sulfur scrubbers, they find them immediately. In the alternative, it is harder for a regulator to do this, right? Like how are you going to go to the factory like, okay, how exactly are you complying with this specific outcome? And then the factory owners or the business owners will be like, give us some time. We need to like check this, check that. It's just a lot harder for you to hold them accountable in the alternative. But the second thing is that even if like legally through the judiciary it's hard to do this, it is a lot easier for social movement to call them out in our world than it is in the alternative. Again, because it's specific with regard to the regulation that corporations need to follow. If they don't follow it, we immediately call them out. It is easier for movement to garner the capital to shame this corporation publicly, to boycott this corporation, which is again a very, very big incentive for companies to comply with this regulation. Because if people boycott their products and their goods, then they like they don't buy it, they don't gain profit, all of which goes to show it is more effective in our work through process-based regulation, even in the best case of the government, ostensibly they can demonstrate the outcome-based regulations could potentially reach better outcomes. Our contention, you don't actually get there in the first place. Why are these regulations going to be effective in our world? Because the contention on Gov is that processors are just processors, you don't know what they create. I think it is absurd. For processes to become regulation, it takes significant amount of effort to pushing for legislative change by these kinds of pre-end depot. In the EU, for example, when green NGOs wanted to lobby for having mandatory sulfur scrubbers in the factory chimney, they needed to prove the efficacy of those sulfur scrubbers and the necessity of imposing it on profit-seeking corporations. And corporations fought them every single step of the way, which means to say they needed to have scientific data, they needed to have evidence to prove why these things were going to be effective and why those things were going to work, in order for governments in the EU to say, I see there is a clear benefit, let us make it into law because we have a duty to protect the environment as well as the people who are harmed by pollution. All of this goes to show that the kind of regulations, the process-based things we're talking about with defending opening opposition will have some effect. I think the extent of the effect can be contended, but there will be some degree of efficacy, and it's a lot more certain that this thing will be imposed on the outside for the reasons that I explained earlier. When that became law, like corporations complained it was expensive, right? But when it became law, corporations just installed it anyway. Carbon output in the EU dropped more than 50% that year, 15% that year, which is an immense impact with regard to the amount of carbon that the EU produces in here. The processes we fight for are going to have a significant degree of efficacy, and we've yet to see why the counterfactual is more effective in the Gulf world. Before I move to the comparative, if that's a POI from closing, I'll take it out. Opening. So much for engagement. What is the comparative in the government's world? We explained that outcome-based regulations were immensely subject to corporate exploitation and corporate capture, because corporate lobbying, when it comes down to it, it's just very, very effective. You reduce the goals and the targets, right? Because like corporations can complain to politicians saying that a 12% carbon reduction is like, unreasonable. We don't have the means to reduce carbon output that much or reduce production. Like a 10% reduction in our energy consumption is very, very difficult to do. And like obviously, no matter how much the outcome or the goals you want to set, corporations are always going to complain because it's always going to come at the cost of their profits. Why is this significantly problematic? It is problematic because corporate lobbying is powerful by the virtue of corporations being so rich. In 2016, Geo Group and Core Civic donated billions of dollars to the Trump campaign. These are private prison companies because Obama wanted to ban private prisons essentially. And what happens is that they were able to get Trump elected, or when Trump was elected, he rolled back the regulation on private prisons and gave them back all the profits they deserve, which just shows the amount of money that corporations have to lobby politicians is immense, comparable to any other green NGOs or any other people pushing for environmental regulation, which shows that they're more often not going to be successful. Unless Gov is able to overcome corporate regulation, they're always corporate lobbying, they're always going to be less effective with regard to creating change. The second thing we explained was that these goals are often going to be unspecific. Like again, what exactly are these outcomes? I think it's possible for corporations to displace air pollution for water-based pollution or land-based pollutant, which is often what happened when these laws were implemented, and then say, we are actually hitting our end goals by reducing air pollution, whereas in reality, they're displacing the pollution elsewhere, creating worse societal harm because those things are not regulated. Even if that's not the case, they often opt for very risky means to do so that could harm consumers in the future in order to meet the very arbitrary yardsticks lodged by corporations themselves. We've given numerous examples where the profit incentive has manifested into terrible harms towards people and reasons why corporate lobbying is so immensely powerful. For all those reasons, we prioritize the certainty of process-based regulation.
I'd like to thank the DLO for that fine speech, calling upon member of government to open a case on site CG. Here.
Hi, 1 second. I'll just set a timer for myself. Okay, starting speech right about now. All right, so I think from our opening government, we've heard that, the environment itself is the effective stakeholder. However, here on closing government, we do agree with the reasons given. We think that this needs to be further specified. So what you've seen in top half so far is this deadlock between emphasizing the importance of a process or say an outcome, right? So we're going to break this deadlock for you on closing government by talking about how we need to protect impoverished people in this debate because they are the actual crucial stakeholders that need to be considered, and how this is better achieved on our side of the house through better leverage over businesses and improved accountability as well, which is another thing that has been debated on quite a lot. All right, so before I move on to my main impacts, let's talk about why these factories are actually very important to consider. The damage done by big companies and MNCs is especially significant to impoverished people, who are one of, or if not the most vulnerable actors in this debate. With regards to the effects of climate change, living conditions are most damaged in areas affected by poverty. This is true because poor neighborhoods are much more likely to be positioned next to garbage dumps or to be polluted by nearby factories because they are situated near dirty rivers, right? So we think that this is true because most cities are designed in a way which unfortunately disadvantages the poor. Most cities are designed this way, and you won't see the same effects in richer neighborhoods, which tend to be situated in the center of the city, right? So as the climate crisis worsens, so will inequality for these stakeholders. An example of an impact would be worsening air pollution and water pollution because of these big companies, which will have an impact on the health of the population, leading to decreasing lifespan, risk of disease, etc. And this is especially important because these people are impoverished and do not have the ability to access the same things as more privileged people. So what do we need to do to solve this problem and help the ones who are most vulnerable in this debate? What we need to do is set quantifiable goals to improve these people's lives. And that's what you get with outcomes-based regulations. So why is it better to set quantifiable goals? A, considering the direness of the situation, we believe that it is bad for companies to stick to a specific process, which may prove ineffective as time goes on. This is due to the unpredictability of economic conditions and also climate change. Because if you do have a specific process applied to all companies, it is not going to be easy to change within like the flick of a finger. Like governments cannot just do that. It is unfeasible. And also companies will probably go crazy and be like, you can't just do that, right? So due to the unpredictability of the situation with regards to multiple factors, both the economy and the environment, we think that companies should be given more flexibility to achieve these goals. I see a POI from OO.
Yeah, so if these people were so poor, why would corporations have any incentive to help them under your arbitrarily quantifiable goals instead of throwing them under the bus for more profit?
Okay, I will answer that as I go on. All right, so one thing you guys said in your speech is how social movements can boycott more easily on your side of the house, right? However, let's start there. This is symmetrical on both sides of the house. We believe that these companies can be called out for not meeting outcomes the same way that they can be called out for not following process-based regulations. So we think that social movements can still have some influence over, companies on our side of the house, and it's not necessarily exclusive to having process-based regulations instead of outcomes-based regulations. And also, even if social movements can mobilize more easily, the issue is that a lot of more privileged people will not really care about the environment because they don't feel the outcomes as proximately. For example, most people love a good deal and they still buy from like fast fashion giants like Shein, which is in fact worse than most of the fast fashion companies we've seen in the past, right? So even if you have a process to improve the lives of these people, if they're not quantified or directed towards a certain goal, we think that there's just not enough being done to ensure that these companies are being kept accountable, because a process doesn't denote a specific goal, and a process, doesn't deter consumers from acting immorally. So what we need is to have a specific quantifiable outcome. And as previously stated by companies have no incentive to do more than the bare minimum, right? And this is exactly what they would do with processes. So if you have a process and a company follows it, right, I think that, they won't really have any incentive to do more. Meanwhile, if you have an outcome, you're able to, achieve it however you like, but you are able to increase the outcome more easily. It's a much simpler process for the regulatory body to simply increase what they want from companies rather than, give them an extremely meticulous process to follow to solve issues, right? We think that in the counterfactual, where you have a process-based regulation in place, we are more likely to deter companies from operating in the country completely because of how tedious it can be, especially with the fact that these processes will probably change throughout time, noting the unpredictability of economics, climate, etc., as previously stated. And also, we think that another issue that cannot be overlooked is greenwashing. We think that when companies can do the bare minimum and say, oh, we are following this process, then it actually makes them less liable to being punished for other violations. So for example, like if a company is doing really well in terms of environmental regulations, the media is going to tend to like focus on this because most companies aren't very good at following environmental regulations. And there will be less of an emphasis or less media attention on things such as how they treat their workers, which may be underpaid, etc. Because again, this is another common case for big companies, which is ignored, right? So we think that having process-based regulations is more likely to allow companies to do the bare minimum and then, get away with other things. Meanwhile, if we simply impose outcomes, they are able to achieve things the way they can do best. And this is good for the people who will be affected by the influences of climate change because of factory pollution. So with greenwashing, it becomes more difficult to enact punitive measures. But if we focus on a quantifiable outcome, regulatory bodies can have an easier time, say, taxing or fining companies for not meeting a specific goal, or threatening to seize operations in certain factories if they don't comply. So overall, we think that having an outcomes-based approach will have the best impacts for those who are most vulnerable, and will also have less of a deterring impact on companies who want to operate in these countries. So there's less of a trade-off between environmental sustainability and economic gain. For all those reasons, so proud to propose.
I'd like to thank the member of government for that fine speech. Calling for a member of OP. Here.
Hello, am I audible?
Yep, you're audible.
Thanks. Hi, name is Ariel. POI through voice, please, might not hear you. If I could also request people to like keep their cameras off because my Wi-Fi keeps not allowing me to hear people. That would be great. At least for my speech, I would appreciate all cameras off. Thank you so much. Setting up my timer. So I'm gonna start speaking in 3, 2, 1. Two responses to the previous speaker. The first thing, she kept talking about how all of these arguments essentially create how they essentially create a world in which you don't want to let companies essentially exploit their workers, right? And how we don't want all of these companies to create a world in which the environment is so harmed to the point that people can't even use it for their sustainability, for their sustainability and to be able to like sustain their lives. Our main issue with this as closing opposition is that these arguments are completely value neutral in the sense that nobody essentially wants inequality in this debate. We think that all sides, all houses in this debate essentially want a world in which we don't want inequality among companies and we don't want inequality among people. And we think that all of us in this debate are fighting for that specific goal. And we think that those arguments are essentially value neutral, right? Second thing is that they said that quantifiable goals are essentially better. Our response is very simple. Our first response is that a process-based regulation is essentially quantifiable to the extent that you can see it happening. We think that our form of regulation is actually much easier as opposed to like tracing back an entire production chain. On government bench, you have to like check the entire like company's process chain to be able to see if they actually did it. But on our side of the house, you just have to check if they did buy and they did use that specific form of technology. We think that's so much easier than tracing back to the entire process. We think that that's actually much more quantifiable than the type of regulations that government bench essentially wants. Our second response to this is if the process is essentially ineffective, like if the process that the regulatory body chose for these companies proves to be ineffective after some time, we think that the state can essentially just change it. We think that they can change it really fast because laws change all the time, and we think that because it's the environment, we have to adapt quickly to this. We think that this is easier to change rather than all of the companies changing their individual processes because they're not like losing carbon emissions fast enough. We think that it's easier to change one process for all of the companies rather than change all of the individual processes that the state can't account for. We think that because of that, it's much more easier to regulate on our side. We think on closing opposition, in the real world, you essentially can't have your cake and eat it. We think that you have to be able to sacrifice something. And we think that on closing opposition, we do concede to the fact that it might be slower on our side of house to be able to get that improvement, but we are going to prove to you why it's essentially more important. On our analysis of the opening half, we think that on opening government, they did talk about accessibility, like where it's more effective based on the individual company's process. However, in opening opposition, they did talk about shirking responsibility of these companies. So what's lacking within the opening half discussion? We think what's lacking is the social aspect of the environmental movement. We think that this debate does not exist in a vacuum of just the environment and the government. We think that the goal of the regulatory body in this debate is to be able to hold companies accountable for polluting the environment, and only closing opposition will talk about how authentic accountability is only achieved through process-based regulations. We are going to divide this extension based on 3 key topics of discussion from the entire government bench. We think that their defense for the outcome-based regulations rely on 3 key points. Number 1, the power of companies, aka accessibilities. Number 2, the effectivity of outcomes. And number 3, the long-term innovation. So now let's move on to the first line of extension then. The first line of extension is how companies do not deserve to choose how to fulfill their requirements. We think that this is a principle that only comes from closing opposition. Nobody else has talked about it, right? We think that the premise is simple. If you are the perpetrator in the scenario, then you do not get to choose how to make amends. All that government said is that these companies should be able to choose how they participate within this policy and protect them, protect the environment however way they want, because they hold the power over their production chain. But now we ask the question, do they even deserve to have a choice in this discussion? We think that closing opposition's answer is no, they do not deserve a choice in this discussion. They don't deserve a choice in this discussion because they have proved to be unconcerned about the environment for years on end now. Proof of this is how company profit literally relies on environmental exploitation. For instance, Coca-Cola has been mass producing plastic for years, or for example, how H&M has been creating landfills filled with fast fashion clothes that they weren't able to sell but went out of trend. We think that these multinational corporations had always had the opportunity to be environmentally conscious, but didn't, and are only scared of losing their image. That's why they greenwash, like what the previous speaker said. We think that plastic is still mass produced. We think that landfills are still filled with shit and trash. And we think that because these companies' actions have harmed the environment to an extreme extent and have also indirectly harmed underprivileged people who rely on the environment, we think it's principally unjustified to give them a choice in how they deal with the environment. So why is closing opposition better on the comparative? We think our house is better on the comparative because we give the power back to the people who were hurt by these corporations' actions. We think that regulatory bodies can serve as a vehicle and represent what people want and the types of changes that people want in these companies. For instance, if they want less plastic, then we will require all companies to use new technology that would create packaging without plastic. Or for instance, we would require them to produce glass instead and use that technology. We want to be able to give back the powers to consumers, and we have this form of accountability that's essentially better because consumers are no longer at the power of multinational corporations who sell them whatever they want to sell them. But at the end of the day, we give the best type of accountability because we give the power back to the people and give them what they want. Second line of extension then is the effectivity of these outcomes. This is a direct response to closing government. Closing government told us that these companies will do the bare minimum on our side of the house. And our opening opposition tried to preempt this by saying that companies can shirk this type of responsibility. And although we agree, we think it relies on the deadlock as to where it's most likely to happen or where shirking of responsibility is most likely to happen. And we are going to break that deadlock as closing opposition. We think that shirking is more likely to happen on government bench because what makes corporations essentially rich is the aspect of the environment that they essentially exploit. This means to say that they can reduce carbon emissions while still creating a bunch of random trash or a bunch of external effects that they don't quantify or they don't declare, right? An example for this is if a company were to say that they reduced their carbon emissions by 30%, but at the end of the day, they still made a bunch of plastic that essentially went to a third world country because that's where they wanted to throw their trash. We think that this external outcome essentially proves how, because these corporations have no incentive but to protect the profit that they do, that they have rather, to protect the profit that they get, we think that they essentially are more likely to exploit on government side of the house when their entire process is within their hands and of the environmental exploitation that makes them rich. We think that because on government's house, they can literally still pollute the environment, but still declare that they do reduce carbon emissions by other means. We think that it's still not solving the problem, and we think that it's even more likely to happen on their side. Third and final line of extension is this idea on long-term innovation. The previous speakers on government bench said that there will be long-term innovation in their side of the house because companies are going to be forced to do whatever process it takes to change the process within their corporation. We think that that's essentially false because because corporations have had years and years on end to be able to change these processes. We think that like plastic has existed for so long and paper has existed for so long, but a bunch of companies are still using plastic, right? We think that because we create an external pressure to adopt the tech now, we think it's better for the production chain and it's an active process as opposed to a reactive one. Never been prouder to oppose. Thank you.
I'd like to thank the member for that fine speech calling upon government whip. Hear, hear.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep, audible and visible.
Okay, I will start in 3. 1 second, there's some disturbance. Okay, I'll start in 3, 2, 1. So basically what we get from the opposition bench is that they lack a fundamental basis in reality. Their ideas are unrealistic and therefore cannot be implemented, and therefore that's why we take this debate over every single house here. So firstly, why do I say this? Because there were 2 moments where they say this. Firstly, when they say that, you know what, we can just change laws, and secondly, this was said by closing opposition, and opening opposition says legislative change. Now, my problem is they can't say lobbyists and lobbying power has increased while claiming we can create legislative change, right? How is this going to happen? First of all, a simple question. If governments are, if they think that outcome-based regulation, where the government is working with them, is not going to work for them, how is being dictated by them is going to work, right? They give the examples of Coca-Cola. Yes, understandable, but how will this translate to legislative change or lobbying? They basically fall prey to their own argument where they say the lobbying is too powerful, therefore the government can't do anything on their side, but the government on our side is surprisingly insulated from lobbying, therefore we can do whatever the hell they want. This is amplified when they said that laws can be changed. Well, that's simply not true, right? So this is taken down by Steffi in 2 important points. What does she say? He's a quantifiable message and better accountability. So let's take that first one. What is quantifiable message? A clear set of goals, right? So this leads to another impact as well. So what is the first thing that she said? A quantifiable message. A quantifiable message can be net free 2050. That's a quantifiable outcome. That's an open-based outcome, right? Net-based 2050. So what is it? This leads to much more better political capital. As our own opening said, that this will lead to governments and companies working together. Why do we feel this happens on our side of the house? Because companies simply prefer to work with us rather than work against us. And this is where the POI that I stated is that, well, in both sides of the house, lobbying exists, but in our side of the house, it's reduced because the business is a partner in it, right? This is more important. So therefore, first of all, our option is very realistic. This leads to a reduced political capital, right? We have a much bigger window and much real alternative for us to pursue. In their care of the house, they say multiple things, but they do not prove to you as to how this will happen via regulatory change. For EPA cannot willy-nilly just change the regulatory standards. It has to be voted by Congress, which they say legislative change, which is susceptible to the same lobbying that they were talking about. So having a quantifiable message leads to better working conditions. And as Steffi pointed out, this will only help the most vulnerable. How does that help the most vulnerable? This leads to a cohesive message, therefore a better accountability. People do not understand net carbon trading emissions programs. They understand net carbon 2050. What does this lead to? When the underprivileged understand the message of climate change, when they understand what the outcome is, what they will do is that they understand the vision, they understand the outcome. What they will do right then is that when they understand the vision, they will put pressure on companies who do not work towards that vision. This talks about the better accountability that Steffi talked about, right? We have the government working with the businesses, and at the same time, when people understand the cohesive message of a simple tagline, a simple goal, which is net zero 2050. Therefore, what will the people do? They will put pressure on the same companies that they were saying cannot be trusted. Therefore, they are exploited, right? Therefore, their argument is completely taken away when they say that companies cannot be trusted. They have an incentive for profit, and more importantly, they should not have a say in the decision-making process. Well, first of all, the economy revolves around businesses. You can't antagonize them and then say, well, we will make climate change work somehow. They have to prove is that realistically, against their own lobbying that they were talking about, how are they going to do legislative change? On our side of the house, we think the lobbying is blunted because we work with them. We work as partners. Therefore, and the secondary option of Steffi already mentioned it is called better accountability. With a cohesive message, which a simple message, which can resonate with the masses. As Steffi pointed out, the underprivileged communities, factories exist in lower lying areas. They're lying in areas, tribal lands, lower privileged neighborhoods. So therefore, what happens is that they would likely put more pressure on these companies when they understand the message better. And we have also pointed out to you, this is not hard for the government to sell, right? This is not hard for the government to pass through a legislature because they are working in hand with the government. So our case is pretty simple, is that our case is much more realistic. And talking about opening opposition, they also mentioned that, mentioned that, regulatory outcome-based regulation is a very vague idea. I don't see how process-based regulation is not. And this correlates to the argument made by closing opposition. Is like, you can quantifiably see regulatory change. I do not regulatory change. I do not think so. Do you think average people have the time and energy to look up tax returns for every single year, 2021, 2022, 2023, and go through them and try to understand, which leads to a better cloud of lack of accountability on their side of the house, because the people do not understand what's going on. Yes, POI, quickly.
Process-based regulations can be passed in spite of lobbying, as evidenced by EU regulations passed over the past years. The difference in your vote is the sustained lobbying and ability for community to use confusion tactics.
Again, you're pointing to anecdotal evidence there. The European Union, again, there were multiple blunted regulations which did not work at the same time as well. You cannot claim that lobbying is so powerful, but we will, as a government, prove much more strong enough to pass it. You have to prove how this will work step by step. And even if you take us at our worst case, and even if you take them at their best case, by antagonizing businesses, they get a couple of businesses or maximum 3 businesses to go along with the regulatory change. But in our side of the house, what we can do, if we can convince 5 to 6 businesses to work with us, we still have net gain. So why do we take it? So therefore, I believe we take it over both the opposing houses. So why do we take it over our own government side? Because they do not engage with the lobbying argument, and they do not prove as to why businesses should be trusted by the government, right? We have continually proven as to what is in it for the businesses, and most importantly, how we can better overcome the lobbying. So for those reasons, I think we take it over our opening government. So therefore, for all of those reasons, I think proud to propose.
All right, I'd like to thank the government whip for that fine speech, calling upon opposition whip to close the debate as a whole. Here.
Hello, can I go to the restroom for a bit?
Yep, sure.
Thank you. Yeah, POIs through chat, he and him, and I'll be starting my speech. Let me just set up my timer. In 3, 2, 1. Climate change is bad and it is urgent, and we all agree that fixing it is our main goal. Yet when we give undeserved autonomy to companies with inverse incentive and whom cause it, and we don't achieve that goal, so what is the standard to judge this whole debate? It's basically where we save the environment, especially for the long run, because band-aid solutions aren't enough. I'll be going through this house by house, but firstly, let me go through just one rebuttal. To the previous speaker, he said that you can't antagonize the companies, that you have to work with them. Well, firstly, we can, and my partner has sufficiently proved this, because they caused much of the climate change. And we still work with them because they still have to comply with the regulation that we impose with them. And it is unjust to let them decide on how they'll serve their sentence, because they will only choose what's best for them and not the environment. Now let's go to their house. On CG, the deadlock is where we solve the urgent crisis of climate change. And that's basically their main argument, urgency, that we need the calculated outcomes that is only gotten on their side. However, this is problematic since now companies can use just band-aid solutions to solve the problems. They can do anything through any means as long as they achieve that, which can be damaging in other aspects. Secondly, this is also inaccurate since the processes are inaccurate that the processes won't solve it, since these processes are done by professionals specifically tailored to achieve the calculated outcomes that they talk of, that is needed to solve the urgent problem of climate change. The difference now is autonomy. So let's weigh. On their side, companies like could do anything, but at least can achieve the calculated outcomes. But they can do bad things, which has other negative impacts. However, on our side, we still achieve like and and get the needed outcomes, and we adopt this meticulous process for this. For example, like we only reduce the vehicle by X miles, like in the example, because the carbon emissions which is saved by that specifically is what's specifically needed to like solve it. So why do we take it over CG? We still get their impact without the harms. Most of MG speech is like listing why it's urgent and why the outcome is why outcome based is the only way to fix it. However, we prove to you that we still get it on our side. Adding to that, it is more principally justified on our side where the perpetrators don't get to like give their own sentences, as my partner said. Now let's tackle their opening. The deadlock now lies in which helps the environment more in the long term, not in urgency. They talked about accessibility, that it's not tailor fit for all. However, it didn't give you any examples of this because it just runs counter. The examples given in the info slide, for example, is reducing tech. However, it is not said how much is reduced. It will depend on the company's scale to basically adapt to it, which is why it's still accessible. Secondly, they talked about the ineffectiveness of processes. However, this is done by competent and unbiased regulators. That is done by like risk identification, assessment, and control, and this tailored to achieve the outcome. The difference is only that the processes is on our side is much more reliable because it is done by like these unbiased people who come from the government and not from these companies itself, which may be untrustworthy and who have other incentives to like focus on. Moreover, there is like more strain to the moreover, they talked about there will be more strain to the regulators. However, well, not conceding but engaging, well, it's their job, it is necessary, and it is also good that they scrutinize because we now ensure that companies are following it, that nothing shady is done. That happens in our side or on their argument. On the flip side, like PM said, that they don't have much work to do on their side when it's focused on the outcome. However, autonomy to them is now bad because their first incentive is profit, and when it runs counter to the environment, they'll prioritize it over anything else. They won't be scared to do anything shady because like there's not much focus regulation on them. At least that's in according to their premise, and results can be like on short term. It's yeah. Now why do we take it over OG? In weighing, we save the environment more without compromise. We prove companies have different incentive and that they may compromise on other areas if we give them the autonomy. Secondly, we hold the companies much more accountable on our side. We disputed their accessibility argument, but even if it's true, it's much more important to hold them accountable due to the things they can do with autonomy, because autonomy on their side is unjustified. But before I continue, does OG have any POI? OG? Okay, CG, if you have any. Okay, continuing to our opening. So why do we take it over our opening? OO talked about how pragmatically it's better on our side, but we elevated by breaking the deadlock of where effectiveness is more likely to happen. The deadlock is where shirking is more likely to happen. My partner gave to you a specific reason as to why companies are not likely to properly change their environmental choices on the government side. My member also told you that companies will always protect the part of their production chain that makes them the most money. This means to say that companies can always choose to declare that they decrease carbon emissions, and those declarations can be true, but they won't target the most harmful thing that the company does, because the most harmful thing they do is what makes them the most money. This is a nuance that nobody responded to and broke the deadlock that existed in this entire debate. Furthermore, our opening talked about the pragmatic outcome of effectiveness, but we elevated this debate by directly responding to the principle of the entire government bench. We elevated this debate by talking about how companies do not deserve and how they will decrease their carbon emissions. Only CEO proved to you why we give power back to the people and prove to you how we create a system of accountability that protects the most vulnerable actors in this debate. For all the reasons stated, we've never been prouder to oppose.
For that, I'd like to thank the output for that fine speech. That brings us to an end of this particular round. I'd like all the teams to virtually cross. Cool. Give me about 5 minutes starting now, and I'll submit the ballot and I'll get ready with my OA. And yeah, thank you so much, everyone. In 2, 1. Cool. So here's how I'll be structuring it. 1, general comment on the round / burden as per the motion. 2, verdict of the House. 3, house by house analysis, which essentially looks like upper bench comparison, bringing in CG, bringing in CO, lower bench, short diagonal, and then finally why the verdict stands as it does. Lastly, overall feedback and ways in which the case lines could have been better done. 1, I think wording of the House. I think necessarily if it says that this House believes that, or even this House supports, I think these particular motions necessarily have to be analysis motions, which are value judgment debates, which essentially looks like government teams having to argue for the truth or false of the statement, and the opposition teams having to argue that it is false, right? I think there is also no need for government teams to implement any sort of policy. However, they should define the terms within which the debate should run and provide a clear metric. Cool. Having said that, verdict of the House, we have opening opposition, followed by closing opposition, followed by closing government, followed by opening government. Cool. Coming to a few comments on the round. I think 1 on the idea of principal arguments. I think you don't necessarily need to have one, and here's why. Because a team without one won't be penalized, because I think I've heard a lot of people say that if a principal argument and the logic behind it is successfully proven, it automatically outweighs any other effective argument, because the whole point of it is that it stands independently and nothing else can beat that, right? But I think what becomes important then is 1, can you weigh the principal arguments? 2, how can debaters do that effectively? 3, what percentage of debaters' argument should essentially lie on a principal argument, right? I believe that whenever you have the burden to or are trying to tell me an event or actor is bound to act in a certain way, I necessarily need a likelihood analysis of the same, i.e., tell me what is going to happen, tie it back to your main argument, and then impact it as well for me. I think that if you do think about what the most important thing in the debate has become, whether or not not on what you did prepare on, but on what basis can the other teams win, I think essentially then you start prioritizing and becomes easier to remove the muddy waters from the debate. I think that debates necessarily always happen on comparatives, meaning that the strategy that all the teams use is utterly correct insofar as you always start with what could be the purpose of this debate? Is there a problem I'm trying to solve? How do I protect those who need protection? And how do I make the other team's characterization work for me? Cool. Having said that, I think I'll just jump right into the analysis part of it. I think that from OG, the push that I get is ends justify the means, meaning that outcomes are essentially going to be a better way to follow the entire process. I think you tell me as to how onto the idea of accessibility, not all companies are the same, meaning that they are diverse in nature with respect to their scope and scale. I think I buy that line of argumentation simply because you tell me as to how manpower constraints exist within status quo, meaning that it affects productivity to a large extent as well. Then you go ahead and tell me as to how it is essentially against companies' incentives to go ahead with process-based simply because their main aim is profit, right? You tell me as to even onto the idea of subject to scrutiny. I think you tell me as to how it isn't as easy from an objective lens, meaning that then you go ahead and tell me as to how it incentivizes companies to be on par to protect their environment, right? And you tell me as to how there's no room to grow on the alternative, and there's more like positive and tangible change in your side. I think 2 things here. 1, onto the idea of like tangible change, unsure as to why that is necessarily true. I think as flagged out by both like opening op and closing op, because I think heavily more closing op, because if they're able to point out that like these countries or like these companies have had years before to go ahead and determine what is essentially messing up their environment, but they only care about it now. I think unclear as to what incentive they have to actually like give a shit about it at this point in time, right? Because then later on, even onto the idea of like subject to scrutiny, I think that when you tell me as to how there's no room to grow on the alternative, I think even if that were to be true, you have to use your worst case to say that, look, this is the alternative that is way better than what opposition is providing any day, right? I think that would have had a clearer picture as to what essentially government's case could have been like. Cool. Going forward, tell me as to how a net positive gain is similar as a benefit on both sides, meaning that you essentially want what's better for climate, you want what's better for the environment as a whole. Cool, cool. You tell me as to how you aren't essentially supposed to base your success based on systematic processes, because I think at that point in time, it is kind of restricting these particular companies to set up like hard box rules, right? I think then you tell me as to how outcome-based processes do a better job. And then with regard to scrutiny on subjectivity, you tell me as to how you can see that it is a possibility, but then you tell me as to how you think it's okay for a company to not be as strict during the process if the outcome is achieved. I think like one thing to flag out here that it was unclear to me throughout the debate is if the outcome isn't achieved and the damage is still done, I think at that point in time, it would be important to flag out how would OG like deal with the intricacies or the consequences or ramifications of even allowing like these big MNCs and companies to go ahead and like abuse these particular environmental resources, right? Because then at that point in time, it becomes difficult to hold them accountable as well. But then you go ahead and tell me as to how if you incentivize companies to take an active role to like go ahead and protect the environment, at that point in time, it allows them to use their unique ideas to bring about climate change, alternative effects that, and like the alternatives are essentially going to be like affecting the productivity of their workers. I think insofar as the idea of using unique ideas to bring about change exists, I think in a vacuum, that is a good argument to make, because I think a lot of time, if proved by your line of argumentation, the systematic procedures are bound to kind of hinder one's ability to kind of think outside the box simply because they have to like adhere to a set standard of like norms and regulations. But I think that in vacuum, that argument stood for me. But then coming and bringing ahead like opening opposition, I think opening opposition posits that if you go away with like this particular line of argumentation, it opens like a way for companies to go ahead and abuse and exploit like the existing systems, right? I think that when you give me like examples of carbon and enforcing limits and CO2 emissions, etc., I think that with respect to how climate and the environment is actually taken into consideration and concern, I think those arguments are valid to make. It understands how it's not inaccessible simply because the cost is less. And in terms of like big tech companies going ahead and abusing these privileges anyway, I think that that kind of argumentation stands as well. You tell me as to how the process is essentially going to be look better because one, outcome is not reliable and because of the lobbying power that exists within status quo. Two, outcomes are not consistent in terms of like these companies exploiting environment in one place and in another place trying to like abide by the environmental rules. Three, in terms of like outcomes being unforeseen, this would look like pharma companies going ahead and like abusing these particular drugs and the resources that they come ahead with. Cool. I think that one argument that's like flagged out for me throughout this entire speech would be that onto the idea of like these corporations to go ahead and like manipulate particular standards, and also goes ahead and talks about like companies being compliant with like regulations. I think that then OO talks to me about how companies necessarily maneuver around the pre-existing regulations simply to go ahead and exploit the system, right? I think that then you tell me as to how this particular thing will always be subject to corporate capture, meaning that there's no actual like accountability or there's no actual transparency in like governance world. I think then you tell me as to how for the mechanism of call out to exist as well, it is way higher on opposition's world, simply in terms of like having to go out and call out someone for not actually adhering to standards that are similar for everyone, right? I think at that point in time, you tell me as to how processes actually become changes only when you see like process of becoming regulations actually happens when you see actual changes. So then I think when you tell me about how like carbon dropped massively in terms of like the EU example and how like the processes have a huge degree of impact, I'm able to buy that particular analysis. I think lastly, I think the comparative was simple, and like I think the binary was simple as well that OO gives to me. OO tells me how corporate lobby is highly subjective and how like at the end of the day, the only thing that these corporations would look forward to is to go ahead and exploit pre-regulating systems, which I think I buy into largely. Cool. Having said that, bringing in like lower bench comparison, the push that I get from CG is this. Firstly, there's a need to improve or like provide impoverished people in this particular setup a better chance of like accountability and give them some sort of like answers for what's been happening. The damage to have factories are an important kind of outlet over here because essentially the damage done through these factories are going to be hard hitting the ones who are mostly in need, simply because their situations are based on say near factories, near these outlets, etc., etc. I think then you tell me as to how the ability to access resources also depends on privilege, which is largely like a fair claim to make. Then later you tell me as to how it would be bad for companies to stick to a singular process because it won't be easy to change, simply because companies will go crazy and then they essentially have this idea of unpredictability, meaning that if they were to do it on their own terms, their accountability factor would be far higher. I think that when you tell me about how call out can be symmetric, because people can call them out for not meeting their outcomes, I think that is fair to say. But again, I think I don't get any actual mechanism as to how that isn't actually helping or like isn't actually working out in status quo, because then you tell me as to how privileged people won't care about the environment anyway. If that were to be true, then the entire argumentation about how these particular companies can go ahead and like be more accountable on their own terms wouldn't essentially stand, because it's like you're at a crossroad. If rich people are the people who go ahead and run these particular companies with immense amount of privilege, at that point in time it becomes unclear to me as to why they would necessarily want to protect the environment at the same time when they haven't been doing so for like centuries together, right? You tell me as to how you need a specific quantifiable method, and you tell me as to how the alternative can look like something being extremely tedious and can't be complied with. You then give me the idea of greenwashing, which is an extremely smart argument to make in terms of like making these particular companies less liable to scrutiny on other fronts as well. Because then you tell me as to how with the outcome-based regulations, they're able to do like their best with the amount of resources that they do have, right? I think then it becomes important to flag out that closing tells me that you can't essentially hope for change if you're being dictated to do the same thing. You tell me how lobbying exists on both sides, meaning that it becomes susceptible to change at a point where legislation is necessarily passed. But I think onto the idea of like a cohesive message, I think insofar as it's there in theory, it is believable, but I'm unsure as to where this line of argumentation would stand. Because when you tell me as to how you essentially put pressure on companies through like this normal mechanism, they're supposed to abide by these particular regulations. But then if these companies were to let alone and do whatever they wish to do, set these outcome goals, etc., I think that the idea or like propensity for actual change becomes minuscule at best, for the sole reason that the accountability factor simply does not exist. Because if you're looking at everything across the spectrum, if you have no particular person to oversee these particular ideas, I think at that point in time, it becomes like difficult to actually go ahead and look at what change is happening. I think then bringing in CO tells me as to how on the same thing on the idea of accountability, the arguments are essentially value neutral, meaning that even if you look at the quantifiable aspect, it is something that can be determined very easily. At that point in time, simply because it is dynamic in nature, it's easier to like change laws if you see something that is affecting the net as a whole, because at that point in time, companies individually change laws that will become essentially super chaotic and it become very difficult to manage as well. Then CO tells me how regulatory bodies should be able to achieve this particular idea of controlling climate change, helping the environment, etc., etc. I think broadly, CO has three major claims. One, onto the power of companies, two, effectivity of outcomes, and lastly, like long-term effects as well. I think that when you talk about whether these companies deserve a choice, I think CO posits that they don't, because like companies like Coke and H&M going ahead and actively exploiting their workers, actively exploiting the environment for like centuries, I mean, like decades together now, simply like being afraid of being shut down now are environmentally conscious. I think that is a fair argument to make, because in terms of like how much it stands, I think it's fair. Secondly, onto the idea of effectivity, I think that you're telling me that effectivity is going to be far better on like ops end, simply because that now you have like a standard set of rules and regulations that monitor all these bodies at the same time. And lastly, tell me as to how when you talk about antagonizing these particular companies, you essentially can do that because you still work with them to achieve these particular goals, right? You tell me as to how the processes are specifically tailored to achieve these particular goals that affect your particular country or your particular area, right? And then I think lastly, you tell me scrutiny is required because autonomy is bad for these companies because they're only going to be profit driven and it essentially isn't going to be helping the environment. So I think based on these particular arguments and analysis that was like given by all these, I mean, like given by all four of these themes, I think that like when I do a lower bench comparison, I think that while CG had like a clear idea of what they wanted to say, I think in terms of analyzing and like kind of characterizing your arguments more, I think that would have helped kind of beat out what CEO was trying to prove. Because CEO, while they do talk about things about power of companies and how there is no guarantee that these companies are ever going to change the mechanisms, I think that they were able to do a better job in like analyzing their particular arguments in a like shorter and crisp manner, bringing in like upper bench comparison. I think that OO and OG, I think in terms of engagement, it was a bit off simply because like OG did not take their case of like say a few particular arguments. But I think as a whole, I would definitely expect a lot more engagement and a lot more analysis on like your particular arguments, because at the end of the day, if that isn't there, it just looks like mere assertion, which again can be bad for both the teams. But yeah, I think largely this was a pretty good and engaging debates. Super interesting to listen to as well. And if you have any questions, you can reach out to me on Discord and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. And yeah, that's about it. Congratulations, everyone, and good luck for the next few rounds. Thank you.
Thank you for the OA.
Thank you so much.
Thank you guys.